While most history books focus on Jews, political dissidents, and soldiers during Nazi Germany, there was a quiet group who refused to salute Hitler, wouldn't fight in war, and paid the price with their lives. They weren't rebels. They weren't political. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. But the conflict between Germany and this group started long before the Holocaust, and it didn't end with the war. The story of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany is one of unwavering faith meeting immovable political force, of peaceful convictions clashing with authoritarian demands, and of a religious minority that chose suffering over surrender. It's a narrative that spans over a century, touching on themes of religious freedom, state control, and the price of conscience in times of crisis. This controversial and painful history between Jehovah's Witnesses and Germany extends from their peaceful arrival at the turn of the 20th century, through brutal persecution under the Nazi regime, secret surveillance during the Cold War, and modern legal battles that still shape how Germans view this religion today. It's a story of purple triangles and concentration camps, of underground meetings and legal victories, of a group that maintained their beliefs despite facing one of the most systematic persecutions in modern European history. Part 1. The Arrival in Germany, 1897 to 1920, Seeds of Faith in Prussian Soil. Early Beginnings and First Publications. The story begins in the closing years of the 19th century, when the Bible Students Movement, led by Charles Taze Russell from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, first crossed the Atlantic to reach German shores around 1897. The movement arrived not with fanfare or grand missionary campaigns, but quietly, through correspondence and publications that found their way into the hands of German readers seeking religious truth beyond the established churches. Russell, a charismatic Bible teacher who would later become the first president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, had been developing his unique interpretation of Christian doctrine since the 1870s. His teachings emphasized the imminent return of Christ, the rejection of traditional Christian doctrines like the Trinity and hellfire, and the belief that only 144,000 faithful Christians would rule with Christ in heaven while the rest of humanity would live forever on a restored earthly paradise. The first German publication appeared as Zion's Wachturm, Zion's Watchtower, a translation of Russell's English-language magazine, Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. These early German editions were modest affairs, printed on simple paper and distributed by hand among small groups of interested readers. The content was theological rather than political, focusing on Bible prophecy, moral instruction, and preparation for the coming kingdom of God. Formation of small communities. As the publication circulated, small communities of Bible students began forming in major German cities. Dresden, with its rich cultural heritage and diverse population, became one of the first centers of activity. Hamburg, the great port city, provided another foothold, as did Berlin, the political heart of the German Empire. These early groups were tiny, often meeting in private homes or rented halls, studying Russell's writings alongside their Bibles. The German Bible students, as they were then known, were largely drawn from the working and middle classes, people seeking meaning beyond the formal rituals of the established Lutheran and Catholic churches. They were attracted to the movement's emphasis on personal Bible study, its rejection of clergy hierarchy, and its promise of a better world to come. Many were disillusioned with traditional Christianity's support for war and nationalism, finding in Russell's teachings a more peaceful interpretation of Christ's message. These early converts were not revolutionary in any political sense. They paid their taxes, obeyed civil laws, and lived quiet, moral lives. Their meetings consisted primarily of Bible study, prayer, and discussion of Watchtower publications. They believed in being no part of the world, which they interpreted as avoiding political involvement while remaining law-abiding citizens. Even in these early years, the Bible students faced opposition from established religious authorities. State church officials viewed the movement with suspicion, seeing it as a threat to their religious monopoly. Lutheran pastors warned their congregations against the American sect and its false teachings. Catholic priests denounced the movement from their pulpits, urging their parishioners to avoid contact with these heretics. The German press also took notice, publishing articles that portrayed the Bible students as dangerous fanatics led by an American charlatan. Newspapers accused Russell of enriching himself through religious fraud and warned readers about the movement's allegedly harmful effects on family life and social stability. These early press attacks established a pattern of negative coverage that would persist throughout the movement's history in Germany. Local authorities occasionally investigated Bible student meetings, concerned about reports of un-German activities. Police officers would sometimes attend meetings to monitor discussions and ensure that nothing seditious was being taught. However, since the Bible students scrupulously avoided political topics and emphasized obedience to governmental authority, based on their interpretation of Romans 13 verse 1, these investigations typically found nothing actionable. The movement's pacifist tendencies were already evident in these early years. Bible students taught that Christians should not participate in warfare, based on Jesus' command to love your enemies, and the expectation that God's kingdom would soon replace all human governments. This position was not yet seen as particularly threatening, since Germany was at peace and military conscription was not a major issue for most citizens. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the first major test of the Bible students' convictions in Germany. Russell had predicted that 1914 would see the beginning of the time of trouble that would culminate in God's kingdom, and the war seemed to confirm his prophecies. However, the conflict also placed German Bible students in an increasingly difficult position. As the war progressed and casualties mounted, the Bible students' pacifist stance became more controversial. While they continued to maintain political neutrality and avoided criticism of the war effort, their refusal to participate in patriotic demonstrations and their reluctance to encourage military service drew unwanted attention. Some Bible students were arrested for refusing military service, though they were often treated as conscientious objectors rather than traitors. The war years also saw increased surveillance of the movement by German authorities. Police kept closer watch on Bible student meetings, and several prominent members were questioned about their loyalty to the fatherland. Publications were scrutinized for seditious content, though investigators found little beyond theological discussions and moral exhortations. Despite these pressures, the Bible student movement continued to grow during the war years. The apparent fulfillment of Russell's prophecies about 1914 attracted new converts, while the movement's message of hope for a better world resonated with people tired of war and suffering. By the war's end in 1918, there were several thousand Bible students scattered across Germany, organized into dozens of small congregations. Russell's death in 1916 had created some confusion within the movement, but by 1918, Judge Joseph Franklin Rutherford had consolidated his control as the new president of the Watchtower Society. Rutherford would prove to be a more confrontational leader than Russell, with a stronger emphasis on preaching work and a more critical attitude toward human governments and religious institutions. The post-war period saw the German Bible students beginning to reorganize and expand their activities. New publications were produced, meetings were held more openly, and efforts were made to reach more people with their message. However, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. Rutherford's increasingly strident criticism of Christendom and human governments would soon put the movement on a collision course with German authorities. The German Bible students of this period were still a small, relatively unknown religious minority. They were viewed with suspicion by many, but they were not yet seen as a serious threat to social order or state security. That would change dramatically in the coming decades, as Germany itself underwent radical political transformation and the Bible students evolved into the more recognizable form of Jehovah's Witnesses. When Adolf Hitler ascended to power in January 1933, Germany's Bible students numbered approximately 25,000 members organized into about 500 congregations. They had no way of knowing that they were about to face the most systematic and brutal persecution in their movement's history. The collision between Nazi ideology and Jehovah's Witness beliefs was immediate and total, setting the stage for a conflict that would test the limits of human faith and endurance. The first major confrontation came within months of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. On April 1, 1933, just as the Nazis were consolidating their power, they orchestrated a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. On the same day, they raided the German headquarters of the Bible students in Magdeburg, confiscating literature and arresting several leaders. This was no coincidence. The Nazis had identified the Bible students as one of several groups that posed a threat to their totalitarian vision. The fundamental conflict between Nazi ideology and Bible student beliefs was irreconcilable. The Nazis demanded total allegiance to the state and the Führer, while Bible students maintained that their primary loyalty belonged to God's kingdom. The Nazis promoted racial superiority and nationalism, while Bible students preached universal brotherhood and refused to participate in nationalist demonstrations. The Nazis glorified war and violence, while Bible students remained steadfast pacifists. Most visibly and provocatively, Bible students refused to give the Heil Hitler salute that became mandatory in German society. They would not raise their right hands in this gesture of allegiance to the Führer, believing it constituted an act of worship that belonged only to God. This refusal was immediately noticeable in schools, workplaces, and public gatherings, marking them as dissidents in the new order. Faced with this immediate persecution, the German Bible students made a controversial decision that would haunt their community for decades. In June 1933, they issued what became known as the Magdeburg Declaration, a document that attempted to find common ground with the Nazi regime. The declaration emphasized their opposition to Jewish business practices and their support for German nationalism, while downplaying their pacifist stance. The document stated, "The Brooklyn headquarters has been and is completely opposed to Jewish big business." The persecution of Germany's Bible students is entirely without scriptural or factual foundation and is inspired by enemies of both Germany and the Bible students. This desperate attempt at compromise was distributed at a major convention in Berlin, where approximately 7,000 Bible students gathered in what would be their last legal assembly in Nazi Germany. However, the Magdeburg Declaration failed to appease the Nazi authorities and actually alienated many Bible students who felt it betrayed their core principles. Within months, it became clear that no compromise was possible. The Nazi regime viewed the Bible students' fundamental beliefs as incompatible with their totalitarian system, regardless of any tactical concessions the religious group might make. Escalating persecution and mass arrests. By late 1933, the persecution intensified dramatically. Bible student meetings were banned, their literature was confiscated, and members were arrested in increasing numbers. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, began compiling detailed files on known Bible students, tracking their movements and monitoring their activities. Children of Bible student families were expelled from schools for refusing to give the Hitler salute or participate in patriotic ceremonies. The persecution was not random but systematic and methodical. Nazi authorities used legal pretexts such as distribution of banned literature, refusal to participate in civil duties, and undermining state security to justify arrests. However, the real reason was the Bible students' unwavering refusal to compromise their religious convictions for political expediency. Workplace discrimination became widespread as Bible students were fired from government jobs, teaching positions, and eventually many private companies. Those who remained employed faced constant pressure to conform, to salute the flag, to contribute to Nazi organizations, and to participate in activities that violated their conscience. Many lost their livelihoods rather than compromise their beliefs. The most tragic chapter in this history began in 1935 when significant numbers of Bible students started being sent to concentration camps. They were assigned purple triangles as identification badges, distinguishing them from political prisoners, red triangles, criminals, green triangles, and other categories of inmates. The purple triangle became a symbol of their unique status as the only religious group to be systematically persecuted primarily for their beliefs rather than their ethnicity or political activities. Unlike other prisoner categories, Bible students faced a particularly cruel psychological torture. They could secure their immediate release by signing a document renouncing their faith. The Renunciation Declaration required them to agree to abandon their beliefs, report other Bible students to authorities, and fully support the Nazi war effort. Most refused to sign, choosing continued imprisonment and potential death over betrayal of their convictions. Camp records reveal that over 2,000 Bible students were imprisoned in concentration camps throughout the Nazi period, with the largest numbers held at Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Sachsenhausen. They comprised only about 2.5% of all concentration camp prisoners, but their behavior in the camps was so distinctive that they attracted attention from both guards and fellow prisoners. Inside the concentration camps, Bible students maintained their faith through secret Bible studies, prayer meetings, and mutual support. They shared food with weaker prisoners, refused to participate in executions or torture of other inmates, and maintained strict moral standards even under the most brutal conditions. Their integrity earned them a unique reputation among both prisoners and guards. SS officers found the Bible students puzzling and frustrating. Unlike political prisoners who might be broken through torture, or criminal prisoners who could be manipulated through rewards and punishments, Bible students seemed immune to standard forms of coercion. Their motivation came from sources beyond the reach of their captors, their faith in God and their hope in a future resurrection. One SS officer at Buchenwald reportedly stated, "We can't break them. They just don't respond to our methods. They're not afraid of death because they believe they'll be resurrected." This incomprehension on the part of their persecutors actually provided some protection, as guards often assigned Bible students to less dangerous work details and trusted them with responsible positions, knowing they wouldn't try to escape or cause trouble. Bible students worked as barbers, hospital orderlies, and domestic servants for SS officers. Their reputation for honesty and reliability was so well established that some high-ranking Nazis preferred Bible student servants in their homes, despite their religious beliefs. This trust created opportunities for small acts of resistance and mutual aid that helped many survive the camp experience. The persecution extended beyond adult male Bible students to encompass entire families. Women were arrested for continuing to hold Bible studies, distribute literature, or simply for maintaining their faith. Many were sent to Ravensbrück, the primary concentration camp for women, where they faced particular hardships and abuse. Children of Bible student families faced systematic discrimination in schools and were often removed from their families by Nazi authorities. The state attempted to place these children in Nazi-approved foster homes or institutions where they could be properly educated, according to Nazi ideology. Many children maintained their faith despite intense pressure and indoctrination, demonstrating remarkable resilience and conviction. Some of the most heart-wrenching accounts from this period involve families torn apart by the persecution. Husbands were sent to concentration camps, wives were imprisoned or forced into hiding, and children were placed in state custody. Yet many families maintained their bonds through secret correspondence and unwavering faith in eventual reunion. The most extreme cases of persecution involved executions of Bible students who refused military service or who were deemed particularly dangerous to state security. Unlike the mass exterminations that characterized the Holocaust, these executions were typically individual cases involving Bible students who had been offered multiple opportunities to compromise but refused to do so. Military tribunals sentenced numerous Bible students to death for refusing to serve in the Wehrmacht. These men, often family breadwinners in their 20s and 30s, chose death rather than participate in what they viewed as ungodly warfare. Their final letters home, preserved in court records and family archives, reveal extraordinary faith and courage in the face of execution. One particularly moving case involved a young Bible student named Wolfgang Kusserow, executed in 1940 at age 20 for refusing military service. His final letter to his family stated, "I am dying for Jehovah and his kingdom. Please don't mourn for me, but rejoice that I remained faithful to the end." His entire family had been arrested for their faith, and several of his siblings also died in concentration camps. What puzzled Nazi authorities and impressed fellow prisoners was the Bible students' apparent immunity to the psychological warfare that broke so many others. They maintained hope not because they expected to survive their ordeal, but because they believed their suffering served a higher purpose. They viewed their persecution as a test of faith that would be rewarded in God's new world. This faith sustained them through the worst horrors of the Nazi period. They comforted dying prisoners, shared meager rations with the weak, and maintained their integrity even when it meant additional punishment. Their purple triangles became symbols not just of persecution, but of principled resistance to totalitarian control. The Bible students' refusal to compromise created a unique form of resistance to Nazi tyranny. They posed no military threat and engaged in no violent opposition, yet their very existence challenged the Nazi claim to total control over German society. Their steadfast faith proved that there were loyalties higher than allegiance to the state, and convictions stronger than fear of death. By 1945, approximately 1,000 Bible students had died in concentration camps, executed by military tribunals, or killed while attempting to maintain their faith under Nazi rule. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten, and their purple triangles would eventually find their place in Holocaust memorials alongside the yellow stars and other symbols of Nazi persecution. When Allied forces liberated the concentration camps in 1945, among the surviving prisoners were several hundred Jehovah's Witnesses who had endured years of persecution while maintaining their faith. These survivors, still wearing their purple triangles, faced a Germany in ruins and a world forever changed by war. Many discovered that their families had been scattered or killed, their homes destroyed, and their former communities devastated. The initial period of liberation was bittersweet for surviving witnesses. While they rejoiced in their freedom and saw their survival as evidence of divine protection, they also mourned the hundreds of fellow believers who had perished in the camps. Many survivors suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such psychological understanding was limited in 1945. Despite their physical and emotional wounds, these survivors immediately began the difficult work of reconstruction. They established contact with the Watchtower Society's headquarters in Brooklyn, which had maintained its opposition to Nazi Germany throughout the war. Financial and spiritual support began flowing from the international organization to help rebuild the German branch of Jehovah's Witnesses. The Watchtower Society had undergone significant changes during the war years. Under Rutherford's presidency, until his death in 1942, and then under Nathan Knorr, the organization had become more structured and centralized. The name Jehovah's Witnesses had been officially adopted in 1931, and the preaching work had been systematized with regular door-to-door evangelism as a requirement for all members. In the western zones of occupied Germany, which would become the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, in 1949, Jehovah's Witnesses found relatively favorable conditions for rebuilding their organization. The Allied occupying forces, particularly the Americans, were generally supportive of religious freedom and viewed the witnesses as victims of Nazi persecution who deserved protection and assistance. The rebuilding process was methodical and determined. Surviving witnesses began locating former members who had gone into hiding or been scattered during the persecution. They organized small meetings in private homes and rented halls, gradually rebuilding their congregational structure. New publications were printed in German, including the Watchtower magazine and various books and pamphlets explaining their beliefs. One of the first major goals was to establish a new German headquarters to replace the Magdeburg facility that had been destroyed during the war. After considerable searching and negotiation, the organization established its new German branch office in Wiesbaden in 1949. This facility would serve as the administrative center for Jehovah's Witnesses throughout German-speaking countries. The growth in West Germany was steady but cautious. Many Germans remained suspicious of any group that had been persecuted by the Nazis, sometimes viewing such persecution as evidence that the group must have been doing something wrong. Others, however, were impressed by the witnesses' courage during the Nazi years and were attracted to their message of hope for a better world. The situation in East Germany was dramatically different and would prove to be another chapter in the long history of persecution faced by Jehovah's Witnesses in German-speaking lands. The Soviet-controlled German Democratic Republic, GDR, established in 1949, was deeply suspicious of any religious group with international connections, particularly one headquartered in the United States during the height of the Cold War. Initially, East German authorities allowed some limited religious activity by Jehovah's Witnesses. Survivors from the concentration camps were permitted to meet and worship, and there was even some tolerance for their door-to-door preaching activities. However, this brief period of relative freedom would not last long as the communist government consolidated its control over East German society. The Socialist Unity Party of Germany, SED, which ruled East Germany, viewed Jehovah's Witnesses as a particular threat for several reasons. Their international organization meant they maintained contact with the capitalist West. Their refusal to participate in political activities was seen as opposition to the socialist state. Their emphasis on individual Bible study and personal relationship with God conflicted with the collectivist ideology of communism. Most problematically from the government's perspective, Jehovah's Witnesses refused to participate in several activities that the state considered essential to building socialist society. They would not join political organizations, vote in elections, or serve in the military. They were also reluctant to join trade unions or participate in communist youth organizations. On August 31, 1950, the East German government officially banned Jehovah's Witnesses, declaring their organization hostile to the state and to the people. The ban was comprehensive, prohibiting all meetings, publications, and activities related to the religion. Penalties for violation included imprisonment, fines, and confiscation of property. The official justification for the ban combined ideological and practical concerns. The government claimed that Jehovah's Witnesses were agents of American imperialism, who used religious cover to conduct espionage and subversion. They accused the organization of undermining socialist construction by discouraging participation in civic activities and military service. More fundamentally, the communist authorities viewed the Witnesses' belief system as incompatible with Marxist-Leninist ideology. The Witnesses' emphasis on individual salvation and divine authority conflicted with the collective socialist ideal and the supremacy of the state. Their expectation of divine intervention to establish God's kingdom was seen as promoting passivity towards social change and revolutionary progress. Following the ban, hundreds of Jehovah's Witnesses were arrested throughout East Germany. Many were sentenced to years in prison for continuing to practice their faith. Others were fined, lost their jobs, or faced other forms of harassment and discrimination. Children of witness families were often denied educational opportunities or subjected to intensive political indoctrination designed to undermine their religious beliefs. The Ministry for State Security, Stasi, East Germany's secret police, took a particular interest in Jehovah's Witnesses. The Stasi viewed them as one of the most dangerous religious groups because of their international connections and their refusal to integrate into socialist society. They developed extensive surveillance networks and infiltration operations designed to monitor and disrupt witness activities. Stasi files released after German reunification reveal the extraordinary extent of surveillance directed against Jehovah's Witnesses. The secret police maintained detailed dossiers on thousands of witnesses, tracking their movements, recording their conversations, and monitoring their correspondence. They recruited informants within witness congregations and used sophisticated techniques to intercept communications with the West. The Stasi was particularly concerned about the flow of religious literature from West Germany and other Western countries into East Germany. They established special units to intercept these materials and identify the networks used to distribute them. Possession of Watchtower publications became a serious criminal offense that could result in lengthy prison sentences. Despite these efforts, the Stasi found Jehovah's Witnesses remarkably difficult to penetrate and control. The witnesses' emphasis on personal integrity and their suspicion of anyone who showed excessive interest in their activities made it difficult to recruit reliable informants. Their decentralized meeting structure, with small groups that often met in private homes, was also difficult to monitor comprehensively. Faced with official persecution and constant surveillance, East German Jehovah's Witnesses went underground. They developed sophisticated networks for maintaining their religious activities while avoiding detection by authorities. Meetings were held in forests, basements, and other locations away from prying eyes. Literature was smuggled in from the West and carefully distributed through trusted networks. These underground operations required extraordinary courage and resourcefulness. Witnesses developed elaborate systems of coded communications, safe houses for storing literature, and escape routes for those whose activities had been discovered by authorities. They maintained contact with the international organization through secret channels, often involving dangerous border crossings and clandestine meetings. The underground nature of their activities created a unique form of religious experience. Bible studies were conducted in whispers, meetings were limited to small groups of trusted individuals, and every gathering carried the risk of discovery and arrest. This intensity actually strengthened the faith of many participants, who saw their suffering as parallel to that of early Christians under Roman persecution. Women played particularly important roles in these underground networks. They were often less suspected by authorities and could move more freely through East German society. Many served as couriers for literature, organizers of secret meetings, and contacts between different groups of witnesses. Their courage and dedication were essential to maintaining the organization during this period of intense persecution. Children under pressure. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the East German persecution was the pressure placed on children from witness families. These young people faced discrimination in schools, were denied access to higher education, and were subjected to intensive propaganda designed to turn them against their parents' religion. East German authorities developed specific programs to rescue children from the harmful influence of their fanatical parents. These programs involved removing children from witness families and placing them in state-run institutions or foster homes where they could receive proper socialist education. Many families were broken apart by these policies, with children not seeing their parents for years at a time. Despite this pressure, many young witnesses maintained their faith and even chose to join their parents in underground religious activities. Some left East Germany illegally, risking their lives to cross the heavily fortified border to West Germany where they could practice their religion freely. These young refugees often became powerful witnesses to the persecution occurring in the East. Even in West Germany, where Jehovah's Witnesses could practice their religion legally, they faced ongoing suspicion and discrimination. The German public remained largely unfamiliar with their beliefs and practices, often confusing them with other religious groups or viewing them as a dangerous cult. The witnesses' door-to-door preaching activities, while legal, were often unwelcome and sometimes led to conflicts with local authorities and residents. Their refusal to participate in military service, while accommodated through alternative civilian service, marked them as different and potentially subversive in a society still dealing with the aftermath of war and the threat of Soviet invasion. German churches, both Protestant and Catholic, were generally hostile to Jehovah's Witnesses, viewing them as competitors and false teachers. Church leaders warned their members against listening to witness preaching and lobbied government authorities to restrict their activities. This religious opposition sometimes translated into social discrimination and economic hardship for individual witnesses. Despite these challenges, the organization continued to grow in West Germany throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The witnesses' emphasis on family values, personal morality, and hope for the future resonated with many Germans who were rebuilding their lives after the devastation of war. Their international brotherhood also appealed to people seeking connection with a larger community beyond Germany's borders. The division of Germany created unique challenges for Jehovah's Witnesses, who maintained strong family and organizational ties across the Iron Curtain. Families were separated by the Berlin Wall and the heavily fortified East-West German border, with little hope of reunion. The international organization had to develop separate strategies for supporting their members on both sides of the divide. The contrast between East and West became a powerful symbol for Jehovah's Witnesses of the difference between religious freedom and totalitarian oppression. They viewed the successful growth of their organization in West Germany and the persecution in East Germany as evidence of the moral superiority of democratic societies, even though they remained politically neutral. This period of division and persecution would profoundly shape the character of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. It reinforced their sense of being a persecuted minority, strengthened their international bonds, and deepened their conviction that human governments were fundamentally flawed and temporary. These experiences would influence their approach to German society for decades to come, even after reunification brought an end to the formal persecution in the East. The German courts and legal recognition, 1970 to 2006. The battle for religious status. The quest for corporate status. As the Federal Republic of Germany solidified its democratic institutions and legal framework during the 1970s, Jehovah's Witnesses began pursuing a goal that would consume their legal efforts for over 3 decades. Recognition as a Körperschaft der öffentlichen Rechts, corporation under public law. This special legal status, granted to major religious organizations in Germany, provided significant benefits including the right to collect church taxes, receive state funding for social programs, and enjoy enhanced legal protection for religious activities. The German system of church-state relations, dating back to the 19th century and enshrined in both the Weimar Constitution and the post-war Basic Law, recognized a distinction between mere religious associations and full religious corporations. Major Christian churches like the Catholic Church and various Protestant denominations automatically enjoyed corporate status, as did the Jewish community and a few other established religious groups. For Jehovah's Witnesses, achieving this recognition represented more than practical benefits. It symbolized full acceptance as a legitimate religion in German society. After decades of persecution under 2 different totalitarian regimes, they sought the security and respectability that came with official recognition. They viewed their previous suffering as evidence that they deserved this protection against future persecution. The process of applying for corporate status was complex and varied by federal state, since religious matters in Germany are largely handled at the state rather than federal level. Each state had its own procedures and criteria for evaluating applications, leading to a patchwork of different legal battles across the country. This decentralized system would prove both advantageous and frustrating for Jehovah's Witnesses as they pursued recognition. German authorities approached the Jehovah's Witnesses applications with considerable skepticism. Several aspects of the organization's structure and practices raised concerns among government officials and legal experts. These concerns would form the basis for decades of legal challenges and public debate about the nature of religious freedom in democratic Germany. The first major concern involved the organization's hierarchical structure and the level of control exercised by the Watchtower Society over individual congregations and members. German officials questioned whether this level of centralized authority was compatible with democratic principles and individual religious freedom. They were particularly troubled by reports of members being disfellowshipped or shunned for questioning organizational teachings or policies. The practice of shunning or Ausschluss became a central focus of government criticism. Authorities argued that the systematic cutting of social and family ties with former members constituted a form of psychological coercion that violated human dignity and family rights protected by the German Constitution. They pointed to cases where families had been torn apart by shunning policies, with parents cutting contact with their children or spouses separating due to religious differences. Another significant concern was the organization's position on blood transfusions. The Witnesses' religious prohibition against accepting blood products, even in life-threatening situations, raised questions about their respect for the sanctity of life and their willingness to endanger members, particularly children who could not make informed decisions about medical treatment. Several high-profile cases involving witness children who died after refusing blood transfusions intensified these concerns. The organization's approach to child welfare also drew scrutiny. Critics argued that witness children were isolated from mainstream society, discouraged from pursuing higher education, and subjected to high-pressure evangelistic activities that interfered with normal childhood development. Child protection advocates raised concerns about the psychological impact of teaching young children about imminent divine destruction of the world and the eternal fate of non-believers. The first major legal battle occurred in Baden-Württemberg, where Jehovah's Witnesses applied for corporate status in the 1970s. The state government initially rejected the application, citing concerns about the organization's commitment to democratic principles and its treatment of former members. This rejection set the stage for a lengthy legal battle that would wind through various levels of the German court system. The state's rejection letter detailed several specific objections to granting corporate status. Officials argued that the organization's theocratic structure, with ultimate authority residing in the Watchtower Society's governing body in New York, was incompatible with German law requiring religious corporations to be self-governing. They also cited the shunning practice as evidence that the organization did not respect the religious freedom of its former members. Jehovah's Witnesses challenged this rejection in court, arguing that the state was applying discriminatory standards that violated their constitutional right to religious freedom. They contended that other religious groups, including the Catholic Church, also had hierarchical structures and practices that could be considered coercive, yet these groups enjoyed corporate status without question. The legal arguments centered on fundamental questions about the nature of religious freedom in a democratic society. Did the state have the right to evaluate the internal practices of religious groups before granting them official recognition? Could democratic governments refuse to recognize religions whose internal governance structures were not themselves democratic? How should conflicts between religious freedom and other constitutional rights be resolved? In 1982, the Federal Constitutional Court, Bundesverfassungsgericht, Germany's highest court for constitutional matters, issued an initial ruling that was partially favorable to Jehovah's Witnesses. The court found that the Baden-Württemberg government had not adequately demonstrated that the organization posed a threat to democratic order or individual rights sufficient to justify denying corporate status. However, the court did not immediately grant corporate status to Jehovah's Witnesses. Instead, it ordered the state government to conduct a more thorough investigation of the organization's practices and to provide more substantial evidence for any concerns about granting recognition. This ruling established important precedents about the burden of proof required when states sought to deny religious recognition. The court's decision emphasized that religious freedom was a fundamental right that could only be restricted when there was clear evidence of harm to other constitutional values. It rejected the argument that hierarchical religious structures were inherently incompatible with democratic society, noting that many recognized religions had similar organizational features. At the same time, the court acknowledged that the state had legitimate interests in ensuring that religious corporations respected basic human rights and constitutional principles. It outlined criteria that could be used to evaluate religious organizations, including their commitment to lawful behavior, respect for the rights of members and former members, and compatibility with democratic values. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the legal battle over corporate status became entangled with a broader public debate about the role of religious minorities in German society. The emergence of various new religious movements, often labeled as cults or sects by critics, had created a climate of suspicion about non-traditional religious groups. Jehovah's Witnesses, despite their long history in Germany, became caught up in this broader controversy. German media coverage of Jehovah's Witnesses during this period was often sensationalized and negative. Newspapers and television programs featured stories about families torn apart by shunning, children denied medical treatment due to blood transfusion policies, and former members describing psychological manipulation and control. These stories, while often based on real experiences, created a public image of Jehovah's Witnesses as a dangerous cult rather than a legitimate religion. The controversy was further fueled by the emergence of vocal critics and former members who organized to oppose the organization's quest for legal recognition. Groups like Sekteninfo, Sect Information, and individual activists like Norbert Hamath, a former witness who became a prominent critic, provided testimony and documentation to support government arguments against granting corporate status. These critics argued that Jehovah's Witnesses employed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to control members, making it extremely difficult for people to leave the organization. They provided detailed accounts of the social and emotional consequences of shunning, describing how former members were cut off from family and friends, often leading to depression, suicide attempts, and long-term psychological trauma. The organization's defenders, including both Jehovah's Witnesses themselves and some religious freedom advocates, argued that these criticisms were based on misunderstandings of religious practices and violated principles of religious freedom. They contended that all serious religious commitments involved some degree of social pressure and that the state had no business evaluating the internal practices of religious communities. As the legal and public debates intensified, both sides recruited academic experts to support their positions. Sociologists, psychologists, theologians, and legal scholars were called upon to provide expert testimony about the nature of Jehovah's Witnesses and their impact on German society. Some academic experts, particularly those specializing in new religious movements, argued that Jehovah's Witnesses exhibited characteristics typical of high-control religious groups. They pointed to the organization's emphasis on obedience to authority, its discouragement of critical thinking about religious doctrines, and its practice of shunning as evidence of cult-like behavior that warranted government concern. Other scholars, particularly those focused on religious freedom and minority rights, argued that these criticisms reflected prejudice against non-mainstream religious beliefs rather than legitimate concerns about harmful practices. They noted that many traditional religions had similar practices and that the democratic state should not be in the business of determining which religious beliefs and practices were acceptable. The academic debate reflected broader tensions in German society about the limits of religious freedom and the role of the state in protecting citizens from potentially harmful religious practices. These tensions were particularly acute in post-war Germany, where the experience of totalitarian manipulation had created sensitivity to any form of social control, whether political or religious. State-by-state variations. The federal structure of Germany created a complex patchwork of different legal outcomes as Jehovah's Witnesses pursued recognition in various states. Some states, particularly those with more liberal traditions, were more receptive to their applications, while others maintained strong opposition based on concerns about their practices and beliefs. Bavaria, with its strong Catholic tradition and conservative political culture, was particularly resistant to granting recognition to Jehovah's Witnesses. State officials argued that the organization's theocratic structure and authoritarian practices were incompatible with Bavarian values and democratic principles. They also expressed concern about the organization's impact on traditional family structures and social cohesion. In contrast, some northern German states, particularly those with strong Protestant traditions and more liberal political cultures, were more open to recognizing Jehovah's Witnesses. These states tended to emphasize religious freedom over concerns about internal religious practices, arguing that the state should not interfere in religious matters unless there was clear evidence of criminal behavior. This state-by-state variation created a confusing legal landscape where Jehovah's Witnesses might be recognized as a legitimate religion in one state while being denied recognition in a neighboring state. This patchwork system undermined the organization's goal of achieving uniform recognition throughout Germany and created practical difficulties for members who moved between states. The most significant legal breakthrough came in Berlin, where Jehovah's Witnesses finally achieved corporate status in 2006 after decades of legal battles. The Berlin Administrative Court ruled that the state government had failed to provide sufficient evidence that the organization posed a threat to democratic order or individual rights that would justify denying recognition. The Berlin decision was based on several key findings that would influence similar cases in other states. First, the court found that the organization's hierarchical structure, while unusual, was not inherently incompatible with democratic principles. Many recognized religious organizations, including the Catholic Church, had similar structures without losing their corporate status. Second, the court addressed the shunning controversy by distinguishing between religious discipline and illegal coercion. While acknowledging that shunning could cause emotional distress, the court found that it was a form of religious practice protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. The court noted that individuals were free to leave the organization if they disagreed with its practices, even if doing so carried social consequences. Third, the court examined the blood transfusion issue and concluded that while the organization's position was controversial, it represented a sincere religious belief that adults were free to follow. The court noted that German law already provided mechanisms for protecting children in cases where parents' religious beliefs might endanger their health, making special restrictions on Jehovah's Witnesses unnecessary. The Berlin decision was hailed as a major victory by Jehovah's Witnesses, who saw it as vindication of their decades-long struggle for recognition. The decision was also welcomed by many religious freedom advocates, who viewed it as an important precedent for protecting minority religions from government discrimination. Ongoing resistance and continuing challenges. Despite the Berlin victory, Jehovah's Witnesses continued to face resistance in other German states. Bavaria, in particular, maintained its opposition to granting corporate status, arguing that the Berlin decision was wrong and that the organization continued to pose threats to democratic order and individual rights. The Bavarian government commissioned new studies of Jehovah's Witnesses, focusing particularly on their treatment of former members and their impact on children. These studies, conducted by state-funded institutions, generally reached conclusions that supported the government's position that the organization should not receive corporate status. Other states took varying approaches, with some following Berlin's lead while others maintained their opposition. This ongoing resistance reflected deeper cultural and political divisions within German society about the appropriate balance between religious freedom and state authority. The continuing legal battles also revealed the persistence of prejudice against Jehovah's Witnesses in German society. Public opinion polls consistently showed that Germans viewed Jehovah's Witnesses more negatively than other religious groups, including Muslims and Jews. This negative perception was based partly on misunderstanding of their beliefs and practices, but also reflected genuine concerns about their impact on families and communities. The German legal battles over Jehovah's Witnesses also had important European dimensions. The European Court of Human Rights had issued several rulings supporting the religious freedom rights of Jehovah's Witnesses in other countries, creating pressure on German authorities to respect similar rights. The European Union's emphasis on religious freedom and minority rights also influenced the German debate. EU officials and international human rights organizations increasingly viewed the German treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses as a test case for European commitments to religious diversity and tolerance. These international pressures were particularly important in the context of German efforts to position itself as a leader in European integration and human rights. The country's treatment of religious minorities became a symbol of its commitment to democratic values and could affect its international reputation and relationships. The legacy of legal recognition. The achievement of corporate status in Berlin and several other German states represented a major milestone in the long history of conflict between Jehovah's Witnesses and German authorities. It provided legal validation for their claim to be a legitimate religion deserving of protection and support from the state. However, the legal recognition did not immediately resolve all of the tensions between Jehovah's Witnesses and German society. Public suspicion and criticism continued, and the organization still faced challenges in areas such as child custody cases, employment discrimination, and medical treatment disputes. The legal battles also highlighted important questions about the nature of religious freedom in democratic societies. How much authority should the state have to evaluate the internal practices of religious groups? What constitutes legitimate religious discipline versus harmful coercion? How should conflicts between religious freedom and other rights be resolved? These questions remain relevant not only for Jehovah's Witnesses but for many other religious minorities in Germany and throughout Europe. The legal precedents established in the Jehovah's Witnesses cases continue to influence how courts and governments approach issues of religious recognition and freedom. Modern-day perception and controversies, 2006-2020s. Recognition without acceptance. The paradox of legal victory. The achievement of corporate status in Berlin and several other German states created a paradoxical situation for Jehovah's Witnesses in modern Germany. While they had won important legal victories that recognized their status as a legitimate religion, public perception remained largely negative, and controversies continued to surround their practices and beliefs. This disconnect between legal recognition and social acceptance would define their experience in 21st century Germany. The legal victories brought tangible benefits to the organization. In states where they achieved corporate status, Jehovah's Witnesses gained access to public funding for social programs, enhanced legal protection for their religious activities, and the symbolic recognition that came with official approval. They could now point to court decisions that validated their claims to religious legitimacy and protection under German law. However, these legal successes did not translate into improved public relations or reduced social tensions. If anything, the high-profile legal battles had increased public awareness of controversial aspects of their practices and beliefs. The extensive media coverage of court cases, expert testimony, and personal accounts from former members had created a more informed but also more critical public understanding of Jehovah's Witnesses. German society in the early 21st century was becoming increasingly secular and diverse, with growing numbers of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and other religious minorities. In this context, Jehovah's Witnesses were just one of many religious groups competing for attention and acceptance. However, their unique history of conflict with German authorities and their distinctive practices continued to set them apart from other religious minorities. Public opinion surveys conducted throughout the 2000s and 2010s consistently showed that Germans viewed Jehovah's Witnesses more negatively than most other religious groups. These surveys revealed that many Germans considered them to be a sect or cult rather than a legitimate religion, despite their legal recognition in several states. The negative perception was based on several factors. Many Germans remained suspicious of religious groups with strong international connections, particularly those headquartered in the United States. The organization's emphasis on door-to-door preaching was seen as intrusive and annoying by many Germans who valued privacy and were uncomfortable with aggressive evangelism. The practice of shunning continued to be a major source of criticism and concern. German media regularly featured stories about families torn apart by religious differences, with particular attention to cases involving children who were cut off from parents or siblings who had left the organization. These stories resonated with German values, emphasizing family unity and individual freedom of conscience. Medical controversies also continued to generate negative publicity. High-profile cases involving Jehovah's Witnesses who refused blood transfusions, particularly when children were involved, reinforced public perceptions that the organization was dangerous and extreme. These cases often resulted in court battles over medical decision-making and parental rights, keeping the organization in the news for controversial reasons. The rise of the Internet in the 2000s and 2010s shattered the carefully controlled image that Jehovah's Witnesses had maintained for decades. For the first time, former members had a global platform to expose the inner workings of the organization, without censorship or fear of retaliation. Personal stories of spiritual abuse, emotional blackmail, and authoritarian control flooded forums, YouTube, and social media. What the Watchtower had long dismissed as apostate lies was now being confirmed by thousands of voices with eerily similar experiences. The Internet didn't create these problems. It simply made it impossible for the organization to hide them anymore. Among the most damning revelations were the mishandlings of child sexual abuse cases. Critics, including survivors and journalists, pointed to the infamous two-witness rule as a systemic barrier to justice, allowing abusers to remain protected unless someone else witnessed the crime, a rarity in such cases. Even worse, internal protocols actively discouraged reporting abuse to secular authorities. Instead, elders were instructed to handle such cases within the congregation. This policy not only silenced victims but enabled predators to continue operating unchecked. The Watchtower's priority was clear: protect the institution, not the children. At the same time, the organization began expanding its own digital presence. JW.org, online videos, even social media-friendly content. But their sleek branding couldn't keep up with the flood of criticism and whistleblower testimonies. In Germany, this tension sparked renewed government surveillance and criticism. While Jehovah's Witnesses insisted on their right to religious freedom, many Germans questioned whether such a high-control group, with a track record of shielding abuse and isolating members, deserved the same protections as mainstream faiths. Their reputation as a harmless Bible group quickly faded. German educators and child welfare experts raised alarms over the group's treatment of children. Refusal to celebrate birthdays or national holidays may seem trivial, but the social isolation it caused was deeply damaging. Children were discouraged from forming bonds with classmates, dissuaded from pursuing higher education, and constantly reminded that the end of the world was near. In a society that values education and civic integration, many saw this as a form of intellectual and social sabotage. Rather than raising responsible citizens, the organization seemed more interested in producing obedient followers. Meanwhile, media coverage in Germany became increasingly critical. Documentaries, investigative articles, and televised interviews with former members highlighted the psychological trauma caused by shunning, the pressure to conform, and the spiritual coercion used to maintain loyalty. The governing body's responses were often defensive, relying on legal arguments about religious freedom rather than engaging with the actual human suffering described. For many outsiders, it felt like the organization was more concerned with protecting doctrine than people. Former members, once labeled as dangerous apostates, have become the most powerful voices in challenging the Watchtower's authority. Their first-hand accounts cut through propaganda and exposed the emotional and spiritual cost of life inside the group. Rather than being bitter rebels, many ex-JWS have become activists, authors, and educators, working to protect others from falling into the same trap. And while the organization continues to spin their narrative of persecution and purity, the truth is now out there, for anyone with an internet connection to see.